Long ago, before humanity reached the stars, there were whispers of help that no one fully understood. People spoke of a time when humans barely managed to survive in space, struggling with broken ships, failing colonies, and dangerous missions that seemed impossible. Most of the records had been lost or forgotten, buried under centuries of human expansion. But in a quiet corner of the galaxy, a small team of researchers stumbled upon something remarkable. They found old, half-burnt logs and fragmented messages from an unknown species that had once guided humanity when no one else would. The discovery shocked everyone. The logs were incomplete, written in a language humans could barely decode. But the message was clear enough. Humanity had been helped when it was at its weakest. Someone somewhere had saved lives that might have been lost forever. Nobody had expected this. The people reading the logs felt a mix of awe and guilt. If someone had once saved humanity, had humanity ever truly remembered them? Or had it gone on, thriving and growing, without a thought for the debt it owed? The research team didn't fully understand the risks of their investigation. They were scientists and explorers, not soldiers or diplomats, but they felt a pull they could not ignore. The logs mentioned coordinates in a distant sector of space, far beyond the reaches of human colonies. There were warnings, too. The ancient messages hinted at dangerous enemies that were powerful and relentless, but the details were vague. That made the team even more curious. They couldn't let history remain a mystery. Something told them that finding the truth could change everything humans thought they knew about their past. On the ship that carried them to the coordinates, there was a quiet tension. Every crew member knew that the journey could be dangerous, that they were venturing into unknown space with no guarantee of what awaited them. But the sense of purpose was stronger than fear. For some, it was personal. One crew member had always felt a deep curiosity about humanity's past, about the forgotten moments that shaped who they were today. Another felt that maybe, just maybe, humanity had a chance to repay a debt it didn't even realize it owed. As they traveled, the team pieced together more fragments from the logs. They learned about the species that had once helped humanity. They were not like humans. They were taller, with eyes that seemed to see everything at once. And their technology was far beyond anything humans had ever created. But the logs emphasized something even more important. It was their kindness, their willingness to intervene without expecting anything in return, that had made all the difference. Humanity had survived because of them. For the crew, it was a strange feeling. They had always believed humans were alone in the universe, carving their own path through endless stars. But now, they realized that survival had not been entirely human. Someone else had reached out, silently and without recognition, changing the course of history. And now, centuries later, it was humanity's turn to respond. The ship approached the first set of coordinates. There was nothing to see at first, just a field of stars, quiet and unbroken. But the logs suggested that they were close. The atmosphere on the ship grew heavier with anticipation. Every crew member understood that whatever awaited them could be extraordinary or terrifying. They had prepared for emergencies, but nothing could have prepared them for the weight of history pressing down on the present at night. When the ship's lights dimmed and the stars outside seemed endless, the team members would gather in small groups. They shared stories of human bravery, of past explorers who risked everything to survive. And then they would return to the logs, tracing the faint lines of messages left centuries ago. It felt almost sacred, like touching a memory that had been buried too long. In those moments, humanity was no longer just a species struggling in the void. It was part of a story much bigger than anyone had imagined. Some of the crew felt a quiet dread. The messages hinted that the species that had helped humanity had enemies, powerful enemies who would not forgive interference. If those enemies were still out there, what would happen when humans arrived? Could they survive? Could they even hope to repay What was owed without risking everything? The questions were unsettling, but they couldn't stop now. Curiosity, responsibility, and the unspoken promise to those who had once saved them carried them forward as the ship moved deeper into uncharted space. The logs revealed something even more astonishing. The species they were seeking didn't ask for repayment. They had acted out of principle, out of a sense of duty, without ever expecting humans to notice. And yet, humans now felt the weight of a promise they had never made, a debt they had never acknowledged. The sense of urgency grew. It was no longer just an exploration mission. It was a chance to honor history, to do something meaningful for a species that had once risked everything to help humanity survive. The stars stretched endlessly before them, silent witnesses to the journey. Each light seemed to remind the crew of the vastness of the universe and of the small, fragile place humans had carved within it. And yet, despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, there was hope. Humanity had a chance to repay a debt that had been forgotten for centuries. And maybe, just maybe, it could make a difference that echoed across time and space. As the human ship moved closer to the distant coordinates, the crew began picking up faint signals. At first, they were just tiny bursts of energy, almost like whispers in the vacuum of space. But as the ship's sensors grew more sensitive, the whispers began to form patterns. Someone or something was trying to communicate. The excitement on the ship was palpable. After centuries of wondering, they were no longer chasing shadows in old logs. There was life, and it was reaching out. The team worked tirelessly to decode the signals. Every shift, every moment was filled with anticipation. Some of the messages were fragmented, full of static and distortion, but there were words that the humans could understand. There were calls for help, faint but urgent. The crew realized that the species that had once helped humanity was in danger. It was a shocking thought. They had expected to find records, maybe ruins, but not a living, suffering civilization calling out across the stars. The scientists on board were both fascinated and fearful. This was history unfolding before them, but it was also a warning. The logs had hinted at danger, but until now, the magnitude was unimaginable. The species had survived against incredible odds before, and yet here they were, reaching out, clearly vulnerable. Humanity had always prided itself on exploration and curiosity, but this was different. This was not a mission of study, it was a mission of responsibility. The crew's conversations were a mix of hope and fear. If we don't respond, one said, they might disappear before anyone even knows they exist. Another countered, but we don't know what's out there. What if the enemies from the logs are still alive? Fear was present, but it was tempered by determination. They could not ignore this. Humanity had once been saved by this species. Now, even if centuries had passed, they owed them at least a chance to survive. Earth's command center was constantly updated with the signals. There were heated debates among the leaders back home. Some argued that it was too dangerous to intervene, that humanity had no obligation to act after so much time had passed. But the majority believed that morality and honor mattered, even across the distances of space and time. Decisions were made. Humanity would go. They would help, no matter the risks. As the ship neared the source of the signal, the crew caught their first glimpses of what had survived. From orbit, they saw signs of ruined cities and structures broken and abandoned, floating in the void or buried beneath planetary debris. But in the shadows of the destruction, there were lights, faint but unmistakable. These were not abandoned ruins. They were shelters, hiding places for those who had survived. The crew felt a mix of awe and dread. They were about to meet a species that had shaped humanity's past, and now depended on them for survival. The first contact was tense. When the crew finally managed to send a clear message, the response came slowly. The aliens spoke, or rather, their form of communication reached the humans' translation systems. Their language was beautiful, but complicated, full of nuances that the crew struggled to grasp. Yet the meaning was clear. They were in danger, their civilization under threat, and they had been waiting, hoping someone would come. The logs had been right. They had not asked for repayment. They had only hoped that humanity would remember them, the humans prepared to descend. They knew the planet was unstable, and that danger could be anywhere. Still, they could not leave those calling out for help. Every member of the team felt a deep personal responsibility. Some quietly admitted they were afraid, but fear was replaced by a sense of purpose. This was more than a mission. This was humanity finally repaying a debt it had forgotten for centuries. As the landing craft approached the surface, the crew saw the first signs of life. Small figures moved in the shadows. The aliens were cautious but curious. Their eyes were wide with both fear and hope. Humanity had come not as conquerors, but as helpers. And in that moment, the two species regarded each other with a mixture of wonder and recognition. As though time had folded back on itself, the humans learned about the enemies that had nearly destroyed this civilization. They had been powerful, relentless, and cruel, far stronger than humans could have imagined. And yet, despite the centuries, the survivors had endured. They had survived not through force, but through patience, cleverness, and hope. Meeting them in person, the humans realized the enormity of the challenge ahead. This was not going to be easy. Saving them would require courage, strategy, and strength humanity had rarely needed before as the first humans stepped out onto the surface. The stars above seemed to watch silently. The crew could feel the weight of history pressing down on them. They had traveled across space to repay a debt, to honor lives that had once saved humanity. And though the danger was real, and though the enemies were still out there was hope. In the eyes of the survivors, the humans saw gratitude, relief, and an almost fragile trust. Humanity had been remembered, and now it had a chance to repay that memory with action. The crew set up communication, relays, and began assessing the situation. They documented every survivor, every structure, every sign of life. The aliens showed them how they had hidden, how they had survived, and what threats still remained. Slowly, a bond began to form. The humans were no longer just visitors. They were participants in a story that had started long before them. And that now depended on their choices. Night fell, and the planet seemed quiet, but the crew knew it was only temporary. Danger could strike at any moment. Yet there was also a strange sense of peace. Humanity had come when it was needed most. They were no longer observers of history, they were shaping it. And in doing so, they began a journey that would change everything, not just for the species they were rescuing, but for themselves and for the galaxy as a whole. The humans landed on the planet with a mixture of caution and curiosity. The surface was harsh and unforgiving. Dust swirled in the thin air, and the remnants of cities long destroyed lay scattered across vast plains. Broken towers jutted into the sky like jagged teeth, and the remains of vehicles and machinery were half buried in the ground. The crew stepped carefully, each footfall echoing on the metal and stone beneath them. They could feel the weight of history pressing down, the memory of what had been lost, and the significance of the moment. This was not just exploration. This was witnessing the consequences of a past conflict, one that humanity had only recently learned about as they moved further into the ruins. The crew began to encounter the first signs of life. Small groups of survivors emerged cautiously from hiding places, their forms unlike anything humans had seen before. Their movements were graceful, deliberate, and full of awareness. Some hid behind debris, peeking cautiously, as though afraid the humans might be a new threat. But as the humans approached slowly, hands raised in peace, the tension began to ease. The survivors recognized something familiar, some distant echo of the past, and trust began to form. Fragile but real. Communication was the first challenge. Their language was unlike anything the humans had encountered, but advanced translation systems allowed for basic conversation. The humans listened carefully as the survivors described their world. They had once lived in thriving cities that stretched across entire continents. Their technology had been incredible, far beyond what early humans could imagine, but it had been destroyed in a catastrophic conflict with a powerful enemy. Despite the destruction, the survivors had endured, hiding in underground shelters, scavenging, and protecting what little remained of their civilization. The humans realized the scale of the destruction. This was not a minor setback. It was an entire civilization brought to the brink of extinction. And yet, in the midst of this devastation, the survivors displayed an incredible resilience. They had adapted to a harsh world, maintained their culture, and preserved fragments of their history. The humans could see the intelligence and ingenuity in their every action, and it reminded them of the debt they had come to repay. This was a species that had once saved humanity, and now it was humanity's turn to save them. The team split into groups to assess the situation. Some explored the ruins of old cities, documenting what remained of the technology and infrastructure. Others focused on establishing safe zones for the survivors, setting up communication networks, and bringing in supplies from the ship. Every action required care. The ruins were unstable, and the humans knew that a wrong step could collapse buildings or trigger old hidden defenses. Each movement was deliberate, careful, and respectful of the history around them. As they worked, the humans learned more about the enemies that had nearly destroyed the planet. These were not ordinary adversaries. They were relentless, calculating, and cruel. Their attacks had been precise, designed not just to kill, but to erase a civilization from memory. The survivors described battles that had lasted years, conflicts that had forced them underground, and sacrifices that had been unimaginable. Hearing these stories, the humans felt a mix of awe and horror. They were stepping into a world shaped by extreme danger, and they understood that their mission would not be simple. Despite the danger, there were moments of quiet hope. The survivors shared stories of their culture, songs and images that had been preserved even in hiding. The humans were struck by the beauty and depth of this civilization. It was a reminder of what was at stake and why their mission mattered. This was more than a rescue. It was a chance to honor a past act of courage and kindness, to ensure that this species could continue to exist and thrive. The first night on the planet was tense. The humans set up temporary shelters near the survivors' underground networks, keeping watch for any signs of the enemy. Though the night was silent, there was a sense of anticipation, a quiet awareness that danger could appear at any moment. The crew took turns standing guard, scanning the horizon and listening to the faint hum of the planet's remnants. The stars above were calm and distant, offering no comfort, only the vastness of space as a reminder of how isolated they were. In the morning, the humans began exploring deeper into the ruins. They found entire districts that had once been bustling with life, now frozen in time. Streets and plazas were filled with the skeletons of buildings, and the remains of vehicles lay scattered like toys abandoned in a hurry. Each step they took was a step into history, a history that had been nearly lost, but was now being witnessed by those who had a debt to repay. The crew took notes, photographed the ruins, and carefully avoided disturbing anything that might still be valuable to the survivors. Some of the humans ventured into areas that had been particularly devastated, finding old laboratories and workshops. There were remnants of advanced machinery, strange devices whose purpose was unclear, and storage units that held centuries-old knowledge. The team marveled at the ingenuity of the survivor civilization, realizing that what remained could still provide insights into advanced technology, energy systems, and ways of life the humans had never seen. But their priority was not knowledge. It was survival and assistance. The survivors began to guide the humans, showing them hidden caches of food, water, and supplies. They shared strategies for navigating the ruins, pointing out areas that were safe and areas that were still dangerous. The humans listened carefully, realizing that trust had to be earned. These people had endured unimaginable hardship, and they had every reason to be cautious. The humans moved slowly, showing respect in every gesture, every decision, and every step. Over time, a bond began to form between humans and survivors. Simple acts, sharing a meal, helping repair a shelter, clearing debris, built trust and understanding. The survivors began to see that humans had come with purpose and care, not as conquerors or opportunists. And the humans saw the strength, intelligence, and courage of a civilization that had survived against incredible odds. This mutual recognition created a quiet but powerful alliance, one that would be necessary for the challenges yet to come. But even as trust grew, the threat of the enemy remained. The humans and survivors knew they could not stay in one place for long. Dangers lingered in the shadows, and the enemy could strike at any moment. Preparations began for defense, and strategies were discussed for how to protect the survivors while continuing to rebuild and stabilize their world. It was a delicate balance, one that required careful planning, courage, and foresight. As the sun set over the ruins, casting long shadows across the broken streets, the humans and survivors gathered together. They shared stories of the past, of losses and victories, of courage and sacrifice. In those moments, the past and present merged. Humanity had come to repay a debt, and the survivors had endured long enough to witness that repayment. There was a sense of quiet resolve, a shared understanding that the days ahead would be difficult, but that together they could face whatever came next. And as the stars began to shine in the night sky, the humans realized that they were not just observers anymore. They were participants in a story that spanned centuries, a story of survival, responsibility, and honor. The ruins around them were no longer just reminders of loss. They were reminders of resilience, of courage, and of the importance of keeping promises, no matter how long it takes. The humans had begun to settle into a rhythm, helping the survivors repair shelters, set up communication networks, and organize supplies. But even as they worked, a quiet unease grew. The survivors whispered stories of an enemy that had once threatened their civilization, an enemy so powerful that it could destroy entire cities in hours. The humans had seen the ruins and heard the stories, but until now, it had felt like a distant memory, a ghost of the past. Now, the threat was becoming very real. The first warning came as a subtle disturbance in the atmosphere. Sensors picked up strange energy signatures moving across the horizon, too fast and too organized to be natural. The crew quickly realized they were being watched, or worse, tracked. It was the enemy, the same force that had destroyed so much before, and it was still alive, still hunting. Panic didn't set in, but determination did. Humanity had come to help, and they could not leave now. They had to protect the survivors and face whatever came. The humans quickly gathered with the survivors to prepare for the worst. Together, they planned defensive positions, set up early warning systems, and created safe zones where the survivors could hide if the enemy attacked. The humans had technology far beyond what the survivors could imagine, but even advanced weapons and shields would be tested against such a formidable opponent. Every action had to be precise, every decision carefully weighed. There was no room for mistakes. Night fell, and with it came a sense of tension unlike anything the humans had ever experienced. The stars, once distant and beautiful, now felt like silent witnesses to the coming storm. Every shadow could hide danger. Every sound might be a signal of attack. The crew worked through the night, checking sensors, reinforcing structures, and ensuring that every survivor knew where to go if the enemy appeared. Exhaustion weighed on them, but their purpose gave them strength. This was not just survival. It was a responsibility that reached back centuries. A debt humanity had promised to repay. In the early hours of the morning, the first attack came. It was not a full assault, but a probing strike fast, precise, designed to test defenses and intimidate. Energy blasts lit the sky, and the humans responded immediately. Their shields activated, weapons targeted, and coordinated maneuvers surprised the enemy. It became clear quickly that humanity was not the same as it had been in the past. They were organized, relentless, and determined, and their goal was not conquest, but protection. The survivors watched in awe as the humans fought. For centuries, they had lived in fear, hiding from an enemy that seemed unstoppable. Now, they saw that help had finally arrived. The humans were fearless, moving with careful strategy, taking calculated risks, and showing a courage that inspired everyone around them. The survivors began to trust that they might survive, that they could rebuild, and that the debt humanity owed was not just being acknowledged, it was being repaid with action. As the skirmish continued, the humans began to realize something important. The enemy had been waiting, perhaps for centuries, for someone to intervene. They were confident, perhaps overconfident, in their superiority, but they had never faced humans with such resolve and purpose. Every move the humans made disrupted their plans, forced them to retreat, and showed that determination could stand against power. It was a lesson that the enemy had not anticipated. The battle was intense, but not endless. The humans focused on defense and strategic offense, using the terrain, the ruins, and their technology to their advantage. Every strike was measured, every maneuver designed to protect the survivors. By the end of the first day, it was clear that the humans had won the initial engagement. The enemy retreated, regrouping and recalculating, while the survivors began to believe in the possibility of safety and hope. After the battle, the humans worked tirelessly to repair damage, treat the injured, and reassure the survivors. They knew that the enemy could return at any moment, and that vigilance would be required for as long as they remained on the planet. But there was also a growing sense of confidence. Humanity had proven it could face unimaginable danger, and the survivors had witnessed a level of courage and skill they had never thought possible. Bonds formed quickly, rooted in shared struggle and mutual respect. The humans also began gathering intelligence about the enemy. They learned that this force was organized, methodical, and had resources that could challenge entire civilizations. But they also discovered weaknesses, flaws that could be exploited, patterns that could be predicted. For the humans, this was an opportunity. They were not there to conquer, but to protect. Every piece of information they gathered would help them safeguard the survivors and prevent another catastrophe. Night after night, the tension remained. The humans organized watch shifts, ensuring someone was always alert for any sign of enemy movement. They trained the survivors in basic defense tactics, showing them how to hide, protect themselves, and communicate silently. Slowly, the survivors regained a sense of agency. They were no longer only waiting to be rescued. They were active participants in their own survival. Humanity's presence had transformed fear into action and despair into cautious hope. The humans also reflected on the deeper meaning of their mission. This was more than a battle or a rescue. It was a repayment of a debt that had stretched across centuries. Every action, every decision, every risk they took was part of honoring the memory of a civilization that had once saved humanity. It was a reminder that courage and kindness mattered, that promises, even unspoken ones, could shape the future. As dawn broke over the ruins, casting long shadows across the broken landscape, the humans prepared for what was to come. They knew the enemy would return, perhaps stronger and more determined, but they were ready. The survivors, once fearful and hesitant, now stood with them, sharing knowledge, courage, and determination. Together, they represented a rare combination of experience, skill, and hope. In the quiet moments, the humans would look up at the stars and remember why they were here. Every light above seemed to remind them of the past, of the long-forgotten act of kindness that had once saved humanity. Now, centuries later, humanity was repaying that kindness with action, courage, and unwavering determination. The debt was being honored, and the galaxy was beginning to witness a story of courage and responsibility that few could ever imagine. And though the threat was far from gone, a new feeling had taken hope, not just for survival, but for justice, for honor, and for the possibility that humanity could make a difference where centuries of fear and destruction had seemed unstoppable. The battle was just the beginning, but it had already shown that the stars themselves could witness something extraordinary, a civilization stepping up to repay a debt it had long forgotten, and a species finding courage it had never imagined. The humans knew that defense alone would not be enough. Protecting the survivors meant going on the offensive, finding a way to neutralize the enemy threat and secure the planet. The crew spent hours analyzing data from the previous skirmishes, reviewing patterns in the enemy's movements, and identifying weaknesses in their strategy. Every decision was carefully weighed. One wrong move could endanger not just the crew, but the survivors, the fragile remnants of the alien civilization they had come to protect. The humans and the survivors worked together, combining their knowledge. The survivors had lived under threat for centuries and understood the enemy's tactics better than anyone. They explained hidden routes, old defensive systems, and safe zones that the humans could use. For the humans, it was a lesson in humility and cooperation. They were technologically advanced, but the survivors' experience and understanding of the enemy's behavior were just as valuable. Together, they began to form a plan that was both bold and precise. The first step was to lure the enemy into a trap. Using the survivors' knowledge of the terrain and the humans' technology, they created decoy positions and false signals to confuse the enemy. Drones and remote sensors were placed strategically to monitor the enemy's approach. The humans knew that this would be risky. If the enemy detected the trap too early, it could backfire catastrophically. Every crew member felt the tension. This was the moment when centuries of preparation, research, and hope would be tested. As the enemy approached, the humans held their positions, ready to act. When the first wave appeared on the horizon, their weapons activated with precision. Energy shields flared to life, and defensive systems hummed as the humans launched coordinated attacks. The enemy was strong and fast, but they had underestimated the humans' determination and strategic thinking. Every move the humans made disrupted their plans, forcing them to retreat and regroup. It became clear that this was not going to be a simple skirmish. It was a decisive battle that could determine the fate of the survivors and the planet itself. The humans advanced carefully, never leaving the survivors unprotected. Teams moved in coordinated groups, using the terrain to their advantage. They struck with precision, targeting command structures and supply units rather than engaging blindly. The enemy had assumed that the survivors were weak and defenseless, but the humans were proving that courage, intelligence, and careful planning could overcome even overwhelming power. Each small victory boosted the morale of the survivors, who began to see that they were not alone and that hope was no longer a distant dream. Hours turned into a long, tense day as the humans pushed forward. The enemy fought fiercely, but the humans adapted constantly, learning from each encounter and improving their strategy. The survivors assisted wherever they could, guiding the humans, relaying information, and participating in the defense. There was a sense of unity that had been missing for centuries. Humanity was no longer just repaying a debt. They were forming a bond that transcended species, built on trust, courage, and a shared determination to survive. By the end of the day, the tide of battle began to turn. The humans had weakened key enemy positions, disrupted their command structures, and protected the survivors from immediate danger. The enemy, realizing they could not win without enormous risk, began to retreat. The humans did not pursue recklessly. They maintained defensive positions, ensuring the survivors' safety while demonstrating strength and resolve. For the first time in centuries, the survivors saw the enemy as defeatable, and their fear began to transform into cautious optimism. The aftermath of the battle was both exhausting and inspiring. The humans and survivors worked tirelessly to repair damage, treat the injured, and restore essential systems. Temporary shelters were strengthened, communication networks improved, and defensive systems remained active to prepare for any possible counterattack. But there was also a sense of accomplishment, a feeling that humanity had acted decisively to repay a debt that had been forgotten for centuries. The survivors expressed gratitude, not just in words, but in trust and cooperation, welcoming the humans into their lives and their world as the dust settled. The humans reflected on what had been achieved. This was more than a military victory. It was a demonstration of courage, strategy, and determination. Humanity had proven that it could face overwhelming odds, not for conquest or glory, but for honor and responsibility. They had repaid a debt that had spanned generations, and in doing so, they had saved an entire civilization from destruction. Night fell over the planet, and the survivors gathered with the humans to celebrate a small victory. There was no grand ceremony, just quiet moments of relief, shared stories, and the beginnings of friendship. The survivors spoke of their past, of the challenges they had endured, and of the hope the humans had now restored. The humans listened, humbled by the strength and resilience of a species that had survived against unimaginable odds. It was a moment of connection, a reminder that the universe was vast, but compassion and courage could bridge even the greatest distances. The humans also understood that their mission was not yet complete. The enemy was weakened, but not destroyed, and the planet remained fragile. Plans were made to continue supporting the survivors, to help rebuild infrastructure, and to ensure that the threat could not return unchecked. The humans knew they had taken the first step in repaying their debt, but the work ahead required persistence, collaboration, and unwavering determination. As the stars shone above, silent witnesses to the events below, the humans and survivors felt a shared sense of purpose. Humanity had arrived when it was needed most, not to conquer, but to protect, to honor, and to act with courage. The debt had been repaid in part, but more importantly, trust had been restored. The survivors now knew that they were not alone, and humanity had learned that bravery and responsibility could shape the future, even across centuries. And so, as the night deepened, the humans prepared for the days to come, aware the challenges would continue, but confident that together with the survivors, they could face anything. The battle had proven that courage, strategy, and a commitment to doing what was right could overcome even the most powerful threats. Humanity had repaid its debt, and in doing so, had shown that honor, compassion, and action could echo across the stars, changing the course of history for generations to come. After the battle, the planet was quiet, but the humans knew their work was far from over. The survivors had endured centuries of fear, destruction, and loss. They had hidden, scavenged, and survived against overwhelming odds, but they still needed guidance, protection, and hope. The humans stayed, not as conquerors or rulers, but as allies and helpers, dedicated to making sure that the civilization they had come to save could finally rebuild and thrive. The first days were filled with practical tasks. Humans helped repair shelters, restore basic systems, and set up clean water and food distribution. The survivors, though weary and cautious, eagerly shared their knowledge. Together, they rebuilt what had been broken. The humans marveled at the resilience of these people, the way they adapted, even after suffering so much. Every small success felt monumental. A repaired building, a working communication tower, A field cleared for planting each step forward was proof that life could continue, that hope could return. During these days, the humans learned more about the survivors' culture. They discovered a rich history filled with art, music, and philosophy. The survivors told stories of their ancestors, their traditions, and their values. Humans listened, taking it all in, realizing that the debt they were repaying was not just for past help, but for the preservation of a civilization's knowledge, memory, and identity. Humanity had arrived in time, and the opportunity to honor that debt fully was unfolding in front of them. Despite the calm, the humans remained vigilant. They knew the enemy had been weakened, but was not completely defeated. Patrols were established, defense systems upgraded, and training sessions continued for the survivors. The humans wanted to empower them, not just protect them. They showed the survivors how to use technology safely, how to strategize, and how to respond in case of another attack. Slowly, the survivors began to regain confidence. They had lived under fear for so long, but now they could see a future where they could stand strong and defend themselves. The humans also took time to reflect on the debt itself. Centuries ago, these people had acted without asking for repayment, saving early humanity when it was vulnerable and struggling. That act had been forgotten by most, buried in time. Now, the humans realized that honoring a debt was not just about returning help. It was about recognizing courage, kindness, and sacrifice, even across the distances of time and space. Every action they took, every bit of effort they made, was a tribute to that forgotten generosity. Slowly, a new community began to form. Humans and survivors worked side by side, sharing skills, stories, and laughter. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. The survivors, once hesitant and fearful, now trusted the humans completely. They had witnessed humanity's courage, strategy, and dedication firsthand. They had been saved not just from destruction, but from centuries of despair. And they knew that the humans had not come for glory or recognition, but to honor a promise that had been forgotten long ago. The humans also began documenting everything. They recorded the survivor stories, mapped the planet, and preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. They understood that this was not just about survival, it was about history, memory, and legacy. Future generations, both human and alien, could look back on this time and see how courage, kindness, and responsibility had shaped the outcome. Humanity's repayment of a debt had become a story for the ages, a story of connection, honor, and resilience. As weeks passed, the survivors began to rebuild more ambitious projects. Entire districts of ruined cities were restored, old technologies repaired, and communities strengthened. Humans worked tirelessly, but they also allowed the survivors to take the lead whenever possible. It was important that the survivors reclaimed their world for themselves, with humanity acting as a guide and supporter rather than a ruler. The bond between the two species grew stronger, rooted in trust, respect, and shared experience. One day, while repairing an ancient communication array, humans and survivors received a message from nearby systems. Other civilizations had begun to hear of what had happened, of humanity stepping in to repay an ancient debt, and they were watching with awe and curiosity. Humanity's actions had sent a message across the stars that courage, responsibility, and honor could bridge even the greatest distances, and that no act of kindness was ever truly forgotten. The survivors marveled at this, realizing that the universe was beginning to recognize their endurance and humanity's commitment. The humans spent months ensuring stability. They established permanent supply lines, strengthened defenses, and trained the survivors in leadership and decision-making. Slowly, the planet began to feel alive again. Children played in cleared streets, markets opened, and the culture that had once been nearly erased started to bloom once more. The humans watched with satisfaction, knowing that their mission had succeeded. They had repaid a debt that stretched across centuries and had given life back to a civilization that had once given life to humanity. The final challenge came not in the form of an attack, but in the realization that their work was complete. The humans had done all they could. The survivors were strong, capable, and ready to face the future on their own. There were no grand ceremonies, no awards, just quiet moments of gratitude and understanding. The survivors thanked the humans not just in words, but in trust, cooperation, and a renewed sense of hope. Humanity had arrived when it was needed most, and they had left a lasting impact on a civilization that would never forget them. As the humans prepared to leave, they looked back at the planet, now alive with rebuilding efforts, laughter, and the hum of renewed life. The ruins that had once symbolized loss were now symbols of resilience and recovery. The survivors waved, a gesture filled with gratitude and respect. The humans felt a deep satisfaction, knowing that they had fulfilled their purpose. They had repaid a debt that was centuries old, and in doing so, had strengthened a bond between two species that would endure for generations. As the ship lifted into space, the humans looked out at the stars. They reflected on what had happened, the dangers faced, the courage displayed, the lives saved, and the history honored. The universe had been watching, and in the silence of space, they felt the weight of responsibility, the beauty of kindness, and the power of action. Humanity had shown that even in the vastness of the stars, promises could be kept, debts could be repaid, and lives could be changed forever. The stars themselves seemed to bear witness. The humans knew that this story would live on, not just in memory, but in the actions of future generations. A civilization once nearly destroyed had been restored. Humanity had acted with courage, compassion, and intelligence. The debt was no longer a forgotten obligation. It was a testament to what humans could achieve when they chose to act honorably. And so, as the ship traveled through the galaxy, the humans carried with them a sense of quiet pride and deep reflection. They had faced danger, uncertainty, and the weight of history. And they had emerged with something greater than victory. They had preserved life, restored hope, and honored a promise that had waited for centuries to be fulfilled. Humanity's repayment of its debt had not only saved a civilization, but had also shown that courage, honor, and compassion could shine as brightly as any star in the sky. The universe had watched in silence, and now the story was complete. The survivors had life again. Their civilization had a future, and humanity had proven that it could rise to meet the challenges of the cosmos, not just with technology and strength, but with heart and honor. The stars bore witness to a moment that would echo across time, a promise kept, a debt repaid, and a bond forged between species that would never be forgotten.